I don't know about you, but there are plenty of things that I do every single day that I don't really feel like doing, but that I willingly do. Welcome to NVC Life. I'm Rachelle Lamb, veteran NVC trainer and relationship coach, helping listeners navigate interpersonal conflict and ground more deeply into relational living. Greetings, fellow humans. In last week's episode with Dr. Joshua Coleman and I touched on the notion of duty and obligation with respect to one's parents. In today's episode, I look more closely at the concept of duty and obligation. As someone who's been studying and teaching nonviolent communication for the past 24 years, as well as paying attention to societal trends and developments, I think it's important to first of all look at what we're talking about when we use the terms duty and obligation. Before I go into the etymology of obligation, I'm going to share some quotes from the Nonviolent Communication Book of Quotes published 3 months ago in September by Puddle Dancer Press, which cites the words duty and obligation close to 15 times. The quotes for the book were pulled from Marshall's books and workshops, and they're sorted according to various themes. I encourage people to get the book if you don't already have it, and I will include a link in the show notes. So, under the heading, being in relationship, anytime somebody does what we ask out of guilt, shame, duty, obligation, fear of punishment, anything that people do for us out of that energy, we're going to pay for it. We want people to do for us only when they're connected to that kind of divine energy that exists in all of us. Divine energy is manifest to me by the joy we feel in giving to one another. Under the heading marriage and intimacy, if you want to have what's originally very beautiful turn into something ugly very quick, define marriage so that once you are married, you have certain obligations and commitments. Commitments defined as demands. Now, that takes what otherwise could be done joyfully and turns it into something ugly. Under the heading power and punishment, we don't want people to do things out of obligation or duty, or out of guilt or shame, or to buy love. With some consciousness, I'm confident we would each see that we only want people to do things if they can do it willingly, because they clearly see how it's going to enrich life if they do. Any other reason for doing things is likely to create conditions that make it harder for people in the future to behave in a compassionate way toward one another. Under the heading, educating our children, built into nonviolent communication is a language of choice. To be conscious, don't do anything you don't choose to do. Don't choose to do anything that isn't to serve life. Don't do anything for reward. Don't do anything to escape punishment. Don't do anything out of guilt, out of shame, duty, obligation. So we want anything done in the school to come out of choice because they see how it's going to enrich life. Under the heading, changing ourselves and others, for most of us, the process of bringing about peaceful change begins with working on our own mindsets, on the way we view ourselves and others, on the way we get our needs met. This basic work is in many ways the most challenging aspect of speaking peace because it requires great honesty and openness, developing a certain literacy of expression, and overcoming deeply ingrained learning that emphasizes judgment, fear, obligation, duty, punishment, and reward and shame. It may not be easy, but the results are worth the effort. Under the heading, daily practices, almost all of the religions and mythologies I've studied say a very similar message, one that Joseph Campbell, the mythologist, summarizes in some of his work. Don't do anything that isn't play. And what they mean by play is willingly contributing to life. So don't do anything to avoid punishment. Don't do anything for rewards. Don't do anything out of guilt, shame, and the vicious concepts of duty and obligation. What you do will be play when you can see how it enriches life. Finally, here's something that Marshall used to regularly say at workshops that is not cited in the book. Whenever you make a request of someone, hand them a little card which says on it, "Please do as I requested, only if you can do so with the joy of a little child feeding a hungry duck. Please do not do as I request if there is any taint of fear of punishment if you don't. Please do not do as I request to buy my love, that is, hoping that I will love you more if you do. Please do not do as I request if you will feel guilty if you don't. Please do not do as I request if you will feel shameful, and certainly do not do as I request out of any sense of duty or obligation." You know, in my earlier days of teaching, I printed up hundreds of those cards and distributed them to people in my workshops for them to use in their relationships, and people really did like those cards. I'm quite sure listeners can hear how the words duty and obligation, in the way that Marshall has used them, are frequently used in combination with the words guilt, shame, and punishment, things we recognize as unfavorable and damaging in the context of relating compassionately and humanely. I'd like to return to the quote I read under the heading Power and Punishment. We don't want people to do things out of obligation or duty, or out of guilt or shame, or to buy love. With some consciousness, I'm confident we would each see that we only want people to do things if they can do it willingly, because they clearly see how it's going to enrich life if they do. Any other reason for doing things is likely to create conditions that make it harder for people in the future to behave in a compassionate way toward one another. Here's what it doesn't say. It doesn't say, first, keep your attention only on your needs, and second, only do whatever you want whenever you want. It doesn't say that. Instead, it gives readers and listeners some clear instruction on what they will need to do to engage out of the energy that Marshall speaks of. When Marshall says with some consciousness, he means people will need to develop the consciousness. And to do something willingly means people will need to make the distinction between doing something because they feel like it versus doing it willingly. Willingly doesn't always mean doing something because we feel like it, or we're in the mood, or when it suits us. To understand what willingly means, we need to look at the next part of the sentence, which is because they clearly see how it's going to enrich life if they do. Okay, so now we need to learn something about what constitutes enriching life. Does enriching life always mean enriching my life personally? Or does it mean enriching capital L life, which might not in the moment be what I want in the sense of granting me immediate satisfaction? So NVC practice, as I understand Marshall to mean it, is about cultivating a consciousness of what life needs and then willingly aligning with that understanding, even when it doesn't satisfy me in the moment. Marshall never says it in those terms, but I'm suggesting that we do, since I've too often seen how people can become attached to an understanding that makes them central to the equation instead of making life central. Marshall sometimes used the term obnoxious giraffe to describe a stage where someone in the initial stages of learning NVC places their personal needs above the need to contribute meaningfully to life. It sounds like this: holy shit, I have needs, and not only that, I'm entitled to have them met. I can't wait to go home and tell my spouse. I think you get the picture. So returning to duty and obligation, I personally have a concern that these words are unfairly denigrated, especially through their association with words like guilt, shame, and punishment. If you look up the word obligation on the online thesaurus, the strongest word matches are accountability, agreement, bond, burden, commitment, constraint, contract, debt, duty, liability, necessity, need, promise, requirement, right, trust, understanding. At no time do the words guilt, shame, and punishment appear, though anyone can create the association. For instance, if a person doesn't carry out what they have agreed, committed, or promised to do, depending on who they are in relationship with, guilt, shame, and punishment may result. And yet NVC teaches us that we have other options that are less costly and far more connecting when we let others down or are let down by them, which is going to happen over and over during the course of a human life. And so I would personally like to rehabilitate the words duty and obligation. I recall a story where Marshall tells an audience that there's nothing that we have to do. It's something he would say at every training, in fact. As the story goes, a woman objected to him saying that and said, "Marshall, there are some things that we have to do." Marshall says, "Like what?" She answers, "Like cooking. When this workshop is over, I will be going home and cooking a meal for my family, which is something I hate doing and have been doing for years, but I have to do it." It's a fascinating story because Marshall reports that she was a quick student and went home that very evening announcing she would no longer be cooking. Evidently, a few weeks later, her 2 sons showed up at a follow-up workshop, and when Marshall asked them how things went when their mother had announced she wouldn't be cooking anymore, they said they were relieved because they would no longer have to witness her complaining. It's a compelling story because it illustrates how relationships are eroded by the bitterness and resentment that comes with people doing things they don't want to do. Despite the favorable outcome in that story, I think we need to consider the reality that there are many parents who spend their evenings cooking for young children who are themselves too young to prepare their own meals. What then? Would duty and obligation apply in this situation? And I would say yes. This is where etymology comes in. Circa 1300 obligation, a binding pledge, commitment to fulfill a promise or meet conditions of a bargain. From Old French, obligation, duty, responsibility, and directly from Latin, obligationem, an engaging or pledging, literally a binding, but rarely used in this sense. The lig part of the word literally means binding, as in to tie together. And though we rarely use the word obligation in that sense, we might find reason to start doing so. To be bound to someone is also to be in relationship with them. Things are very rarely, if ever, 50-50 in any relationship. And this is especially true in the parent-child relationship. Children are bound to their parents and parents are bound to their children, but in distinctly different ways. I may not feel like cooking a meal for my children, but if I remember my promise to life, my obligation to life, and the nature of the reciprocal arrangement I'm in, I will cook a meal for them willingly because it meets my own need to be in relationship with life and to contribute to life, in this case to my children's health and well-being. If I cultivate that kind of consciousness and attend to the task from that energy, I'm far less likely to feel bitter and resentful. I'll be in touch with the fact that I'm fulfilling my duty, my responsibility, my promise to life, and to participate in its continued unfolding in my given capacity as an adult and parent. The way I see it, to be a mature adult is to recognize that life won't continue in a healthy manner without our willing engagement to care for life, and that tending to the necessities of life, often in the form of giving to others, sometimes and perhaps even often requires doing things we don't always feel like doing. I don't know about you, but there are plenty of things that I do every single day that I don't really feel like doing, but that I willingly do because I recognize that feeding life is how we are in turn fed. And the more conscious I am of this beautiful arrangement, the more I can be grateful for what life asks of me. Thank you for tuning into NVC Life. For future episodes, be sure to subscribe on iTunes, Spotify, or YouTube. For free resources or to book a private session with me, head over to RachelleLamb.com. Until the next time, stay sane, grateful, and generous.